Okay. We're good. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Sorry we're running a little bit late. Our next guest speaker is Brendan. He'll introduce himself. We're very lucky to have him here. I'll hand it over to Brendan.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brendan, as Graham said. I'm here, I suppose, I'm here to talk a little bit about trauma, how we deal with trauma. I'm going to talk a little bit about my story as well. Going to talk a little bit about self-care as well, and the different scenarios of trauma, especially when we're working with little fellas, little kids, young kids, the signs, what to watch for, what to look for, and how to engage with those situations. So a little bit about my story. I was born in 1971 at a place called Crown Street Women's Hospital at Surrey Hills. And that's the last time I ever saw or heard my mother in that hospital. I was then, from that hospital, I was fostered out, illegally adopted to a family where my adopted father was the first and only, as far as I'm aware, blind Aboriginal physiotherapist. And he comes from a place called Tanami Desert. Tanami Desert, for those that you don't know, Tanami Desert's halfway between Alice Springs and Darwin, up in the Northern Territory. And how Dad ended up coming down here to Sydney is when he was 5 years of age, he got some dirt in his eyes. And because they were poor and living out in the bush or in the desert, he lost his eyesight. And it was just by chance that Christian brothers from a school at Wahroonga on the North Shore were up there, saw Dad, and picked him up and brought him back down to Sydney. There's a lot of firsts that my dad did. He ended up staying and living at a boarding school for the blind at Wahroonga, again called St Edmunds. He mastered Braille at the age of 9. He was one of the first to go all the way through, finish his schooling. And Dad and two of his blind mates went over to England and studied over there to become a physio. And here's where I come into that story, is that Mum and Dad couldn't have kids, so they fostered me. And I must have took all the weight and the stress because they had 5. They ended up having 5 of their own. So I was the eldest. And look, from a very young age, I knew I wasn't part of that family. They talk about, that connection, that maternal connection. I didn't feel that from day one. Rules were always different from me. Growing up in that family, the rest of my siblings all went to school together, and I was separated and went to school by myself in a totally different school. Mirror image, I could never see a mirror image within that family, and as we all got older, I think I was 12. I was 12 years of age when I was told that I was adopted, and as soon as that sort of cat was let out of the bag, the sibling rivalry started to take place. And look, a few years down the track from that, you know, I'd hit 14 and 15, and as soon as I was old enough to open that door, I was out. I found myself at a lovely place called King's Cross in Sydney. 14, 15 years of age, and back then I loved it. I loved the cross, and I was starving and craving for I suppose what you'd call that Aboriginality, what it meant to be a black fella, and found myself hanging around black fellas that were drinking in the park, and getting involved in that crowd, and the media played a big part in identifying Aboriginality to me, because all I would see on the news and the TV was, you know, Aboriginals drinking, Aboriginals fighting. It was all the negative stuff. And look, I grew up thinking, well, that's what I've got to be. I've got to be like that. And look, I'll be very short with the rest of it. I went through everything. I went through the petrol sniffing, the alcohol, the drugs, incarceration, the self-harm. Write a list and I'll tick the list. I'll tick the box. But look, I'm here today. The good thing about it is I'm here today, and I've gone through that. And I sit before you as a specialist, as a trauma counsellor. And I've worked in many different fields. I spent 15 years in the child protection, before removal, during removal, after removal, and every role that I've had has always been in a role where I'm helping either Aboriginal community, or that lower socio and economical sort of arena, because trauma doesn't discriminate. Trauma is not a new thing for especially for Aboriginal people. We've been dealing with trauma for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And I'll give an example. Is in my father's country, when they have sorry business, the women will sit down together and they start weaving. They'll start weaving knots. And the more intricate the knot, the more the trauma that they're dealing with. And the men will go and start to chip stone tools. And again, the process of making tools and chipping stone is not about grabbing one rock and another rock and bashing them together. There's a process that we use when we're making these tools, and it's not always hitting the rock, making the tool, and there it is. Depending on what we're making, depends on the greater thought process that we need to create those tools. So again, trauma is not a new thing for us. I think what is new for us and what we struggle with is the tools that we had to deal with that trauma. Where it's harder for a lot of us to access that knowledge and to go back to country and to start utilising the resources that are on our country to deal with that trauma. And Aboriginal people are so spread out, and you know, getting together as family back on, you know, family land is hard as well. So as a child, I was going through school. I almost feel sorry for some of those teachers that had to deal with me, because again, trauma back, I'm talking early 70s, late 70s and into the 80s. What was trauma? Children like myself were deemed just naughty children that need to be punished. Again, it's a I suppose the conversation today is how do we work with these children. What do we need to look out for? Where are the tools to help, you know, our children with what's going on? There are so many different things that relate to trauma, traumatic instances, traumatic events. I've done a bit of work in the education department in Redfern. I was working at a school, and I would say within a month, I'd turn up at school at 8:30 in the morning, and I had kids just swarming to me of all race and colour, not just little Koori kids. And Uncle Brendan, hugging and grabbing hold of me and this, and I'd give them a big hug back. Because a lot of these kids were living in Redfern and Waterloo. And, you know, it was very, very quickly I was pulled into the office and spoken to and said, listen, you shouldn't be doing that with these kids. You shouldn't be hugging these kids, or, you know, you just a pat on the head. And I said, well, that's rubbish, and I won't stop doing what I'm doing. Because a lot of those kids, the only time they were ever getting that affection was when they were coming to school and seeing Uncle Brendan. And I think we seem to have lost common sense and wrapped, you know, everything up in cotton wool, and you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't. And especially for men and males that work in industry or work with kids, it's very hard, because society has painted that picture of, you know, I grew up as man works, he brings the money home, and the woman stays at home and looks after the kids. And so that, I'm seeing it change. It's slowly changing, that thought mentality. But again, look, I love kids. And if it's not going to be me speaking up for these kids and, you know, looking after these kids and advocating strongly for them, then who else is going to do it? Because they're not getting it at home. And so knowing that little bit of history as well of what's going on at home. And I'm thinking, you know, we've all probably been exposed to, you know, those little kids that are coming to school that they've been up all night the night before because the neighbours or mum and dad are, you know, drinking and partying, and these little kids are coming to school tired with no breakfast. So of course they're going to start playing up. And I was seeing so many Koori kids and non-Indigenous kids being sent to the principal office for being naughty. And all it took was a conversation. What's going on at home for you, bud? That's all it took, was just someone to ask that child, what's going on? Oh, Dad's been arrested again. And those conversations with those children, I felt aren't being had anymore. There just seems to be not enough time to have those conversations. We all have an agenda. And all it took, again, was a conversation. Trauma, look, having those conversations and building up those rapports, not only with children and the community, is very important. Conversations with community gives you good insight of what's going on outside of school or in those hours where those kids are at home. And that's part of being community, is being aware and having those conversations. It's not the questions that are hard to ask, I've found. It's how you ask the question that makes the difference. Be it, you know, for non-Indigenous people, again, we have a saying, engagement takes many cups of teas. And that's what it's about. You go, and I've seen some organisations pop up within communities in Redfern, and all of a sudden Closing the Gap's popped up. So government will throw all this money at closing the gap. All these little health organisations will pop up and they need bums on seats. So they'll get themselves off down to Redfern and they'll start door knocking and try to sign up as many people as they can to get them on their books and to get that funding. After that's been done, we'll never see those people ever again, and that community is still in the same situation and predicament as it was before these people turned up. What I suggest is first going there, having a yarn, knocking on the door, tell them who you are and where you're from. Have that first yarn. Go back again later the next week, go and have another yarn. And every time you end up going back, that yarn becomes a little bit longer, a little bit longer, and a little bit longer. When those community members are ready to engage, they'll let you know when they're ready to engage. The culture, for me, what really helped me as well get back on track was culture, was my culture. You won't find an Aboriginal person that's done more research into becoming an Aboriginal than a stolen generation person, because we want to fit. We're trying to find out where we belong. So we research the whole lot to find out what suits us, what fits with us. And culture, look, I was lucky, I suppose, where my father's country, he's very strong in culture and song and all of that sort of stuff. So I was very lucky to get back on track and get back into culture, dancing, singing, painting, making artifacts, a whole lot of stuff, and reconnecting with country. I know what it's like not to have a connection to country. I grew up not black enough to hang with black fellas and not white enough to hang with white fellas. So I argued and fought with both. And for especially for an Aboriginal person, when we don't have family, we're not walking on country, we're just floating on top with no connection. So culture for me was probably first and foremost of what helped me get through and get back on track with where I'm at now and sitting here today. Again, the culture with little kids, language, culture, dancing, it needs to be, the two go together. The healing with trauma and culture, the two go together. Needs to be united. Look, normally I love sitting down talking and not having anyone else respond, but I'm finding it to be. I'm saying it to be. It's a bit funny. I'm waiting for those questions to come up, but you're all muted. I wish I could have one of these mute things too. I've currently got 3 kids under 5 at home. Muted go down well. So look, I'll give an example of, and some of you may have heard this. I'll give an example of how intergenerational trauma can be passed and how it is passed. Here's a story of an Aboriginal woman, grew up on the mission, and back in the day, welfare would turn up and take the kids. And that woman's now got a child. And that mother and child are walking across the street or in a town, and all of a sudden they'll see a government-looking car or a police car, and mum doesn't say anything to the daughter. What mum does is just squeezes the little girl's hand just a little bit tighter than normally. While that car's going past, mum will squeeze daughter's hand And when the car's gone, mum relaxes her hand. Now, that'll go on for a few years. And what happens is that little girl grows up and she makes that connection. She makes that connection that mum, every time there's a police car, mum's squeezing my hand and I'm feeling mum's fear of that car. So that's how easy that intergenerational trauma can be installed into our next generation. Just from a hand squeeze. I could go even deeper and talk about the intergenerational trauma in utero. Now, that trauma that's passed down from mother to child in utero, I've seen a lot of stuff working in child protection. I've seen babies shaking because while in utero, mum and dad were in a DV relationship. And as soon as these little babies hear a loud noise, I've seen the baby shaking because of that trauma that they'd suffered while in mum's belly. That's right, Roseanne. It doesn't have to be physical. It is the energy, and this is where I'm going, leading up with this now. When mum, for an example, when mum is in a volatile relationship and dad's yelling or partner's yelling and physical or just the yelling, mum's adrenaline will spike. And that adrenaline spike will go down into the baby. See, all of a sudden, baby's already starting to get those rushes of adrenaline. And babies can hear. Baby will marry that up. Oh, dad yelling, all of a sudden I'm getting this adrenaline spike. This feels good. Already it's in the baby. When baby's born, it's installed in the baby to seek out that same cause for that adrenaline, that rush, that adrenaline rush. The genetic makeup, even when baby's being formed in the womb, those adrenaline rushes and spikes can have an effect on our DNA. It's what I believe is one of the biggest problems with what we have now: heart disease, mental health, diabetes. I believe that trauma from that stolen generation mob and from a lot of other things is a big player in where our health is at today with that trauma. So when working with young people that have suffered or suffering from trauma, I still to this day, when working with, and not just kids, with adults, and I'm hearing their stories and the trauma that they're going through, I still to this day will shed a tear in front of these people. And some people will say, well, you're getting emotionally involved. That's rubbish. I'm human, and if I wasn't crying at some of these stories, then I would be concerned with where my mental health is. It's human nature to be like that. So again, seeing these little kids going through some of this stuff and being told to just pat them on the head, I don't understand that. I really don't understand that. The kids will, and probably a lot of you know that the kids will display, traumatic things through the violence, through the physical, through their actions. And the older they get, that starts to change. The more they can vocalise, then it becomes the words. And I'm seeing Look, one of the problems I was faced while working in child protection is a very female-dominated industry. And I've seen 5-year-olds being able to manipulate women at that age because they're surrounded by women. So they're able to manipulate, they work them out. That's it, and that's their survival. They're surviving. It's hard to be a father if you've never learnt from a father. It's hard, and the same with the women. It's hard to be a mother if you've never had mother in your life. So from being that stolen generation, there's a whole heap of stuff that I'm still going through right now. I'm still learning how to talk, how to share my problems. Because if I grew up to be by myself, if I didn't have anyone close enough to me, then I wasn't going to be responsible and didn't have to be responsible for anyone else. It's my problem, I'll deal with it. And that's how I grew up, that's how I survived. So to this day, I'm only just starting to be able to share my problems, talk about my problems. Get the real definition of the word love when I'm talking to my family. And again, that's right, Roseanne. You pass, if you've never had father in your life to teach you how to be father, that's then passed on. How's your kids going to know what it's like to be father? And again and again and again. My children are never going to meet their grandmother. My children are never going to meet their uncles and aunties. My children are never going to meet or have a relationship with anyone from my mother's side of the family. With my dad's side of the family, and I'm talking my biological father, I've never met him. I don't know who he is. And we're matriarchal. Aboriginal people are matriarchal. My family's not. We're patriarchal because it starts with me. We learn from our mistakes. And again, my upbringing wasn't, wasn't a good sort of upbringing. Wasn't that bad. I was a naughty kid. I got a few good floggings as a young fella. And look, again, my journey's still going on. 5 months ago, I received the phone call from Link Up. They just found a first cousin of mine. Now, I live in the Blue Mountains and I work in the Western Sydney area. And this first cousin they just found lives in Mount Druitt. He's lived there his whole life. He's 59 years of age. They say he had about 2 years to live. I'm the only family member that he's ever met. First cousin. Out of that reunion, I was able to find my grandmother, who's buried in Katoomba. And Katoomba is a 20-minute drive from where I currently live now. My mother was 5 years of age when they removed her from my grandmother and locked them up in jail for 2 weeks and sent them to Cootamundra Girls' Home. My mother and my aunties and uncles, after that day, had never seen their mother again. And I just, out of a reunion I had 3 months ago, I've just found where she's buried in an unmarked grave in Katoomba. And again, it's passed on again. My kids will never hear the voice or get a cuddle from Nan. I never heard my mother's voice. Never heard her voice. Never got to touch her, hug her. I'm one of 10 siblings, all of us removed. 4 of us removed in New South Wales and the other 6 in Victoria. I've met 3 brothers and none of us talk and haven't spoken for 5 years. And that's based on the trauma that they've gone through in the homes And same with my sister. I've met a sister, but you know, it takes two to have a relationship, and not through it, me not trying to make contact and to organise, you know, the kids to at least grow up together to try to sever that separation. Unfortunately, things don't always work out the way you'd like them to. And look, that's where I'm at right now. Is with my trauma. It's continuing. It's ongoing. It doesn't go anywhere. It's constant. Every year at my mother's birthday. Every year. I had a discussion. I've got a 5-year-old boy at home, and I had a chat with him last year. He was asking me about Nanny Mitchell. Why did they take you away from Nanny Mitchell? How do you talk to a 4-year-old boy, a 4-year-old child, about this sort of stuff? So I was very cautious in how I had this discussion. And sorry, I'm just reading a question from the question was from Jean. Is it right, Jean? The question that Jean had asked is around the effects of trauma. Could they have a positive way? And I can say honestly that it is. That's what I'm doing here today. That's what I'm here now, is working with trauma and culture and putting the two together. I've just started a role with Link Up New South Wales, as a reunification counsellor. So I'm taking Style and Jen back to country for the first time, meeting family, and I'm going on that journey. And I only just started last week, and I took it as a sign. I live my life like this. Some people get a bit nervous. Things pop up in my life, and I don't ignore them. I grab hold of them and I go, this is what I've got to do. See you later. And I'm off and I'll do it. If it lasts, it lasts. If it doesn't, it doesn't. If it doesn't last, then I'm not meant to be there. And I've always been this type of person where if I'm not happy where I am, I'll leave. If I've got to go and busk on the streets of Sydney to pay my bills, then that's what I'll do. But at least I'm happy in doing what I'm doing. So my journey's taken me to Link Up at the moment, and today I've just come back from an interview process working with one of the juvenile detention centres as a youth officer. So I'm hoping I can get my foot in the door there, and to bring that culture and trauma, and start to address that and deal with that as well. But it's part of my life, what I do. I live it, I breathe it. I don't see it as work, if that makes sense. And even when I go home, I'm having to deal with the wife's trauma of me possibly spending extra money at Bunnings. But it's ongoing. I'm surrounded by it. My family are all going through it. You know. But I love it. I wouldn't have it any other way, I don't think. Some of us have chosen to do what we do, and that's what I feel is my role. So quiet, aren't they?
Just really enjoying hearing you speak, mate. Thank you so much for, sharing your story and your trauma. And yeah, honestly, just sitting here at home. My name's Dina Youssef. I'm with the Smith family, and I'm on Boonwurrung land, and just mesmerised by what you're saying and sharing with us. So cheers, mate.
No worries. You're welcome. Thank you.
Brendan, it's Gail here.
Okay.
I work in with health here in Ballina. And is it like we're trying, you know, people come to us with a lot of trauma and, you know, and what I would like, how do I deal with a client that comes in that's got, you know, intergenerational trauma when I'm faced with it myself, like at you every day? What sort of strategies would you suggest?
I've got a look. I've got a really good dimmer switch, and the dimmer switch is part of my self care. So boundaries, put up those boundaries from day one, and focus. You need to focus on self. If you're not 100% on your game, then you can't help the next person that walks through the door, because a lot of us are in a role where we're giving, and most of the time we don't get a lot back.
No.
And that's where burnout comes into it. If you're giving all the time, you end up becoming a big empty hole or bucket and trying to fill. So always make sure every day, what I do every day after work is I have to cross the Nepean River.
Oh, yes.
And what I do is I visualise that I've got a whole lot of post-its stuck all over me. And those post-its have got written on them shit and other stuff, just negative stuff all stuck on them. And I visualise that the wall of the river has made a wall on the road. And I drive through that wall of water, and by the time I get to the other end of the bottom of the mountain, all those post-it notes have washed off. And then I feel safe to drive home. I still, when I can.
Well,
it nearly caused me a bit of trauma, that did. I still, when I get home, have a fire, but I always make sure that my battery is 100% charged. Now you're gonna come across clients that have had some very traumatic time in their life. A lot of those clients I've found is they're spinning like a washing machine. And there's a whole lot of different clothes that are inside the washing machine. And so if your client's spinning like this, sometimes when we're in a room with those clients, we can pick up on that anxiety and that spinning as well. For example, a client's come in and they're doing these ones. The legs are going all the time. And if you're sitting there long enough, you'll find yourself and your legs starting to shake as well. You're picking up on that anxiety. So what we need to do, what I do is a client will come in spinning. Our first role is to slow down the washing machine. Don't stop it, because we're not going to stop it. But slow it down enough so we can actually make out a decent colour, a pair of socks. And then reach in and grab those pair of socks and then work on that issue. And then that way what you're then doing is you're getting that client to move forward. And I always say to clients, I don't care how fast you move, you can crawl, but as long as you're moving forward, that's enough. And so I'll focus on the one thing. I help that client, support that client to get through that. Next thing you know, you've got a reference point with that client. So when you pull out the next bit of clothing, and it might be a bit bigger, so the issue might be a bit bigger, that client might turn around and say, I can't deal with that. You can then bring that back to that reference point and say, well, listen, when I pulled out that sock, that small sock, we worked through that problem. You took yourself off down to the doctors, or you followed through with that appointment. So you've just shown me that you can do it. There's your reference point, and just keep working slowly. one of the metaphors I often say we are as workers is we're like cattle dogs. And we're herding the sheep. So we're not actually telling the sheep which way to go. We're just on either side, making them constantly go forward. And that's how I see that's what I see myself as a cattle dog, just running around behind, making sure you're still moving, just keep moving. And of course that word empowerment comes into it, because we're not always going to be there.
Yeah.
And it's hard because we know what the end goal is how it looks like. But with a lot of these clients, they're struggling to open up the door.
Yes.
A lot of them will have, there's 4 walls to build a house. Most of our clients have got both hands on the last remaining wall. What we need them to do is to slowly take one hand off that wall to prop up the second wall. But it's a hard job to get them both to leave, to take one hand off that last remaining wall. They're clinging to it. That's all they've got.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Thank you.
No worries, Gail. I hope that helps.
Yes, it does.
We do everything. All of us would do everything differently.
Yes.
And with working with clients that have traumatic backgrounds, the more we're exposed to it, the more fine-tuned we become with our tools.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you.
No worries, Gar. Thank you for that. I'll wrap it up, play a bit of Yiddicky.
Just do your little...
A bit of Yiddicky. Look, I've brought in what I call a Yiddicky. This is not called a didgeridoo. It's not called a didgeridoo. It's called a Yiddicky. And I'll explain the difference between a Yiddicky and a didgeridoo. A didgeridoo is a Yiddicky that's not played traditionally. Does that make sense? So a Yiddicky is a musical instrument. When I play Yiddicky in my father's language means voice. So we sing through it while we play. We just don't blow through it and make a noise. We sing songs. And everything has a song. Everything has a meaning. If I was to sing dit more, dit more, dit more, dit more, dit more, dit more, then the Yiddicky sounds like this. If I was to sing wackadoo, wackada, wackadoo, wackada, wackadoo, wackada, then the song will sound like this. How it got its name didgeridoo, the story goes, when the first white fella went in the bush and he heard this instrument, he heard a song, didgeridoo, 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 and he went, oh, I know what that's called, that must be a didgeridoo. He was a very smart white fella, that fella, because what he did next was he looked at these two things, and they were going like this, and he said, oh, I know what they're called clapping sticks. Because they're two sticks you clap together. I told you he was very smart, that fella. So different clans have different names for these depending on language. In my father's language, it's called Bilma, and Bilma is male and female stick. There's even song about the Bilma. That's a little bit of beauty. I was going to see if I could get the CEO up to do a bit of shaker leg. The law is with women and why women aren't allowed to play. I'm sure some of you may have heard this. There are two reasons. One is because it's phallic symbol, and the second is because of the breathing. So when I play the yidiki, I'm breathing in through my nose, blowing out my mouth at the same time, but I'm using my back, my chest, my stomach muscles, and sometimes when I'm playing, I'm actually going. It's almost the same breathing as contractions, except minus the pain. Okay, so it's sent to take away the egg, the woman's egg, because of that breathing. Because man and woman are different inside. So that's the other reason why women shouldn't play the yidiki. Yeah. Look, I hope I've helped. Man's business, women's business. I hope I've helped someone out there amongst all those faces. And as Graham said, get the questions through. If there's any questions you need to ask, Graham and whoever will get onto those questions. And the thing I'd like to leave on is self-care. Self-care, self-care, self-care. Art, hobby, bushwalks, self-care. I can't emphasise that enough. I've seen too many people, oh, it won't affect me, it won't affect me. I've seen big men, bigger than me, it's not going to affect me. And subconscious, it's the subconscious that it gets into those people. So self-care is very important. And look, I'd like to thank everyone for hanging around. I know it's nearly dinner time. So thank you for your time, and I'll hand it back over to Graham.
I think Brendan a big part of it. He's always been very kind with his time, and the same with Mary. And I just want to thank him for his, insights and the sharing. What to me is must have been very, very painful, but he's always willing to, particularly white fellas, to get an idea of what trauma is like for our people. And we all live with it, and we all battle through it, but sharing that, sitting around like our ancestors used to, and yarning about it and talking about it is how we can help ourselves with that. So look, I can't believe 2 hours has gone already. It's not enough, but we are aiming to have another one. Maybe we'll just call it Culture and Healing Part 2, and we'll just continue to do what we've done today. And we hope that we've given you just a taste of what we want to do in the future. We know there's a need. 100 people tuning in right now is an example of the need that's out there, and we're trying to understand us, our culture, and to get a, you know, like a family talking through those things and making our lives better. So I want to thank you all for your time and for your interest in our very first webinar. It's a historic day. Many reasons. This is just the beginning for us, and I can see some familiar faces there, some people who work for Gunawirra as volunteers, and I want to thank you all. And look, don't be strangers. You're part of our family now, and we hope that in the next month, when we have another one, that you'll tune in again. But like I said earlier, I just want to thank these guys and Katrina, our amazing social worker who organised all these things. And yeah, look, stay safe and well, you, your families and communities, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you.